Have you ever wondered how the wisest man on earth could end his life feeling as if everything was meaningless? King Solomon, celebrated for his vast intellect and legendary wealth, did just that. Though he began with a divine blessing that set him apart from every ruler before him, but his final days were marked by sorrow, regret, and a haunting realization that he had strayed too far from the path of true devotion. Solomon's journey reminds us that no human being, regardless of blessings or fame, is immune to the dangers of pride and temptation. Stay with us through this revealing story of how a king who had it all discovered in his last days that every worldly accomplishment crumbles without a steadfast relationship with God. You'll uncover the real troubles of the wisest man on earth, his hidden secrets, his desires, and his many mistakes. Make sure to watch this video to the end to see how his final reflections can still transform our own lives today. When Solomon first ascended the throne, the kingdom of Israel was on the verge of greatness. His father, King David, had established a strong foundation, uniting various tribes under one banner. Yet, even with this impressive inheritance, nobody could have predicted the heights Solomon would reach. In those early days, Solomon showed an extraordinary humility. Instead of celebrating his status as a young monarch, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing in on him. Many anticipated he would ask for stronger armies, more extensive lands, or perhaps a treaty with other powerful kingdoms. Instead, when the Lord appeared to him in a dream at a place called Gibeon, Solomon made a choice that would define him for generations. He requested wisdom to lead God's people well. This moment at Gibeon wasn't just a charming story. It was a turning point, signaling that Solomon desired to be more than just a ruler. He longed to be a faithful steward of Israel's destiny. Moved by Solomon's request, God promised him not only wisdom beyond measure, but also riches and honor unmatched by any other king, with a crucial condition that he remain faithful to God's commands. Soon after, Solomon's supernatural discernment became known far and wide. Perhaps the most famous example is the dispute between two women claiming the same infant. He proposed a startling test: divide the baby in two, to reveal which of the women truly cared for the child's life. When the real mother relinquished her claim to save the baby, Solomon's ruse exposed the truth. News of his decision spread like wildfire, and people marveled that the spirit of God's wisdom resided in him. From that moment, the king's star rose rapidly. Scholars compare Solomon's intellect to a beacon that drew the curiosity of even the most distant lands. Politicians sought alliances, traders brought him exotic gifts, and philosophers came just to witness firsthand the mind that could outthink any worldly sage. All signs indicated an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity for God's people. Yet deep underneath this promising beginning lurked unrecognized risks. Young monarchs thrust into fame can forget that character must keep pace with success. When everyone around you hangs on your every word, it becomes dangerously easy to trust in personal brilliance instead of the divine guidance that made it possible. Even though Solomon's heart at first burned with devotion, subtle pressures from within and without would soon lead him to compromise in ways no one expected. But in these initial years, he still shone brightly. He authored striking proverbs filled with moral clarity and practical wisdom. He composed songs that celebrated the grandeur of creation and the love of God. He presided over a flourishing administration that ensured justice throughout the realm. For a time, Solomon's reign looked unstoppable, and his spiritual passion seemed unshakable. Yet this glowing chapter was only the beginning. Soon, alliances and entanglements would creep in, challenging Solomon's single-minded devotion to the Lord. And while he reigned with brilliance at the outset, this young king was about to meet temptations far greater than any cunning dispute over a child. With a singular focus on making Israel a powerhouse of the ancient world, Solomon embarked on projects that dazzled his subjects and stunned foreign emissaries. His court bustled with skilled administrators who executed his plans, lavish building campaigns, improved trade routes, and fortified cities. Israel's influence stretched across regions, making it a crossroads of commerce and culture. Perhaps the crowning jewel of his early achievements was the construction of the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a project envisioned by his father David, but realized under Solomon's direction. Built with cedar from Lebanon and adorned with gold, silver, and bronze, this structure wasn't merely an architectural masterpiece. It was a tangible reminder that the God of Israel dwelled among his people. For 7 years, laborers toiled, artisans engraved intricate designs, and the city watched as the temple rose to become the spiritual heartbeat of the nation. When it was finally completed, people from every corner of the kingdom gathered for the dedication ceremony. They watched in astonishment as priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies. In that solemn moment, a cloud, symbolizing the presence of God, filled the temple. Solomon's voice carried across the assembly as he offered a heartfelt prayer, one that praised the Almighty's faithfulness and asked that any who turned toward this temple in genuine repentance would experience divine mercy. This prayer became a defining memory for Israel, capturing the deep spiritual roots that Solomon once nurtured. The king's fame grew. Stories of his wisdom and prosperity reached distant lands, inspiring visitors like the Queen of Sheba to undertake grueling journeys just to witness Solomon's court firsthand. She arrived with spices, gold, and precious stones, testing him with riddles to see if his intellect lived up to the rumors. By the end of her stay, she admitted that what she'd heard barely reflected half the reality. Not only was Solomon an insightful ruler, but the God he served was unlike any she had known. Yet success has a curious way of breeding more success. And before long, Solomon's wealth soared. Fleets sailed forth, returning with exotic goods, ivory, peacocks, rare woods, shimmering gemstones. Royal treasuries overflowed with silver to such an extent that silver itself became commonplace, scarcely worth mentioning when set beside the king's staggering accumulation of gold. The opulence of his throne, crafted with ivory and overlaid in pure gold, declared his might to every visitor who stepped into his grand halls. To onlookers, it must have appeared that Solomon had found the perfect balance between heavenly blessing and worldly power. He was a mighty monarch, a spiritual leader, a brilliant administrator, and a man beloved by his people. If there was ever an example of divine favor coexisting seamlessly with earthly grandeur, Solomon embodied it. Still, the seeds of trouble were quietly taking root. In the pursuit of expanding this prosperity, the king turned to political alliances that sometimes conflicted with the Lord's explicit commands. Each success became a reason to push a little further, to align with one more foreign power. Perhaps it felt like a natural progression, a diplomatic approach to keep enemies at bay. Or maybe the initial treaties seemed innocent enough, simple negotiations for trade and peace. In the midst of gold, luxury, and powerful friends, a slow shift was happening within Solomon's heart. Though he remained the revered figure who built a temple for God, he was no longer the modest young ruler who had knelt in prayer, desperately seeking wisdom above all else. The dazzling wealth and the chorus of accolades were quietly chipping away at his humility. From the outside, it was still an era of unprecedented splendor. People spoke of Israel as never before. It was the envy of kings and queens. Commerce prospered. The temples, palaces, and public works all testified to a golden age. If you approached Jerusalem back then, you might have believed you'd stepped into a realm where heaven kissed the earth. But that wasn't the whole story. Beneath the glitter was a slow corrosion of values and devotion that would soon place the entire kingdom on a collision course with divine judgment. And in a realm where gold was as common as stone, the intangible treasure of spiritual faithfulness was becoming increasingly scarce. Solomon's thirst for stability and peace led him to forge alliances with neighboring nations. Initially, such treaties looked harmless, perhaps even wise. Securing peace through diplomatic connections could spare Israel from constant warfare. But diplomatic marriages soon followed, a common practice for sealing agreements in the ancient world. One royal bride became two, then many, then hundreds. Each new marriage introduced a flood of foreign customs, traditions, and idols into Jerusalem's once devoted atmosphere. Whispered rumors began circulating among palace servants. Have you seen the private shrines being constructed? Do you know which gods are worshipped behind closed doors? These quiet murmurs hinted that something had begun eroding the once pure devotion that Solomon had championed. What made it all the more perplexing was that Solomon still publicly honored the Lord. He maintained the temple services and presided over religious festivals. Outsiders might have assumed his faith remained steadfast, but spiritual compromise rarely shouts its arrival. Instead, it seeps in slowly, often dressed in alluring robes of cultural exchange or personal preference. At first, Solomon might have justified these arrangements as harmless accommodations. After all, didn't alliances keep the kingdom safe? Weren't the foreign altars kept hidden or outside Jerusalem's most sacred spaces? Did it really matter if his wives practiced a different religion, so long as he himself still acknowledged the God of Israel? In time, such rationalizations can dull the conscience, making it easier to drift further from absolute devotion. Meanwhile, Solomon's popularity didn't wane. People still revered him. Why shouldn't they? The economy thrived under his leadership, resources abounded, and life was comfortable for most. Yet spiritual watchers within the kingdom began to fret. Even the common folk whispered, "Is the king so tolerant that he disregards our covenant with God?" Others said, "He knows more than we do. He's the wisest king in history." Surely he understands what he's doing. Still, the seeds of discord were sprouting. Some of Solomon's new in-laws hailed from nations whose gods demanded frightening rites, rituals that deeply contradicted the worship of Israel's living God. A handful of courageous prophets spoke out, warning that such alliances, no matter how practical they appeared, threatened to unravel the sacred bond between Israel and the Almighty. Alarmingly, Solomon, once eager to heed divine instruction, began to turn a deaf ear to those cautionary voices. Whether from pride, complacency, or the seductive comforts of a multi-kingdom empire, the king slipped into a pattern of appeasement. The heart that once yearned for wisdom above wealth had shifted into a posture of compromise, gradually normalizing what God had forbidden. The full consequences of these choices were not immediate. The palace remained glorious, the feast tables remained laden, and no foreign army amassed at the gates. But the slow turn of Solomon's devotion spelled inevitable trouble. He was stepping onto dangerous spiritual ground, and it was only a matter of time before the facade of endless prosperity would begin to crumble. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment Solomon crossed the line from mild compromise to outright disobedience. What's clear is that by the middle of his reign, he had sanctioned the building of high places dedicated to foreign deities. Idols once whispered about in secret were now standing openly, sharing the landscape with the temple built in honor of the Lord. These pagan altars and shrines weren't merely decorative. The worship of false gods like Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech carried disturbing practices, including rituals that Israel's laws explicitly condemned. The devout within the kingdom recoiled, recalling how God had repeatedly warned against idolatry throughout the scriptures. Hadn't Moses cautioned that embracing foreign gods would lead to catastrophic judgment? Hadn't Joshua commanded the people to tear down altars to idols, not erect new ones? Spiritual leaders began to voice their alarm. Some approached Solomon personally, pleading with him to remember the covenant. They reminded him of how God had blessed him with wisdom, wealth, and influence, blessings meant to be used for God's glory, not for forging ties with pagan cults. Others prayed that perhaps the king had been misled by poor counsel or manipulated by those seeking personal gain. But Solomon's response was disheartening. He persisted in accommodating these new forms of worship, possibly telling himself it was necessary for maintaining harmony among his many wives and allied nations. Or perhaps he believed his own devotion could remain intact, no matter what other gods encroached upon Israel's domain. That kind of rationalization is a hallmark of spiritual downfall, believing one can serve two masters without consequence. God's patience is immense, but not infinite. According to Israel's faith tradition, the Lord himself appeared twice to Solomon, making it clear that idol worship was a grave offense. These weren't subtle messages, but direct warnings. Yet the king, ensnared by the complexities of his alliances, chose to disregard the very voice that had once guided him toward greatness. Imagine the shift in the palace atmosphere. Where once daily prayers might have echoed pure devotion, now an undercurrent of unease was ever present. Faithful priests and prophets must have felt torn between loyalty to their king and fidelity to God's commands. Had it not been for the temple's sacred legacy, many would have wondered if Israel's spiritual destiny was in jeopardy. Indeed, that destiny was at stake. Solomon's repeated disobedience indicated a looming disaster. From a biblical perspective, idolatry was no minor slip. It was a direct assault on the covenant relationship God had established. The heartbreak of it was that Solomon had witnessed God's favor in astonishing ways. He had seen prayers answered, felt the divine presence, and possessed insight that surpassed human logic. To turn from all this for the sake of political or personal convenience was baffling and tragic. Some say it was pride. Others suspect the indulgent comfort that dulled Solomon's once zealous spirit. Still others believe the sheer number of foreign wives, with their array of religious traditions, overwhelmed his judgment. Whatever the reasons, by the time the warnings became urgent, his heart was too entrenched in compromise to retreat easily. This was no minor rift, but a wide hole in the foundation of Israel's identity. Before long, those cracks would widen, and the consequences would shake the kingdom to its core. When warnings from prophets failed to stir repentance, events took a darker turn. People began noticing the shift in God's favor, small signs at first, but undeniable. Political unrest emerged within regions once loyal to the crown. Dissenting voices in the royal court whispered about corrupt practices and neglected responsibilities. Rumblings of rebellious sentiment started cropping up among those who felt alienated by the king's policies. Behind palace walls, Solomon wrestled with his conscience. He wasn't ignorant of Israel's history. He knew full well how swiftly God's judgment had fallen upon past leaders who refused to turn from evil. Yet with each passing day, his hesitations waned. Possibly, he convinced himself that he'd already gone too far to reverse course. Maybe the weight of the entire nation's alliances and treaties felt insurmountable. Or perhaps, in his pride, he still believed he could manage both sides, devotion to God and permissiveness of idolatry, without incurring disaster. It was during this period that a prophet named Ahijah delivered a chilling message. Meeting Jeroboam, one of Solomon's capable officials, Ahijah tore a new cloak into 12 pieces. He handed 10 pieces to Jeroboam, declaring that God intended to tear most of the kingdom from Solomon's lineage because of the king's blatant unfaithfulness. The prophecy left no room for misunderstanding. Solomon's disobedience would fracture the very kingdom he had inherited from David, unraveling the curtain of prosperity thread by thread. Word spread about Jeroboam's potential role in Israel's future, creating tension in the royal court. Solomon tried to suppress this threat, possibly seeing Jeroboam as a conspirator rather than a divine instrument. As internal struggles brewed, external enemies also took note. Surrounding nations, once subdued, sensed an opening. While Israel was still formidable, the aura of unassailable might that Solomon had cultivated began to fade. The heartbreak lay in the fact that all of this was preventable. Had Solomon repented sincerely, had he destroyed those idols and reaffirmed his trust in the God of Israel, perhaps the tragedy could have been averted or softened. Instead, it became evident that the remaining years of his reign would be overshadowed by the knowledge that his legacy was compromised, and that his kingdom would not remain intact for his heirs. Such spiritual and political unraveling weighed heavily upon Solomon's soul. He still commanded respect and astonishments. Few dared criticize him openly, but deep down, he knew the consequences of divine displeasure. The man who once composed uplifting psalms now found himself haunted by regrets, grappling with the gloom that settles in when one ignores repeated warnings from above. In the quiet corridors of his palace, where gold still gleamed but the echo of God's approval had grown silent, Solomon stood at a crossroad. He might have tried to cling to illusions of strength, but the truth was inescapable. The favor that had once elevated him far beyond any earthly ruler was dwindling. As the sun rose on what would be his last day, King Solomon was no longer the fearless young monarch who had knelt in prayer, asking for a discerning heart. His hair was graying. His posture, once upright and regal, bore the weight of accumulated sorrow. Though he still sat upon a throne that dazzled with gold and ivory, the man who occupied it felt empty. In the quietness of the palace's early hours, while many of his courtiers still slept, Solomon wandered through the corridors, memories tugging at his mind. He paused at the windows overlooking Jerusalem, recalling the temple he had painstakingly built to honor God, a testament to his once pure desire to see Israel thrive under divine rule. He remembered how the priests could hardly stand when the temple filled with God's glory on its dedication day. That memory now felt both glorious and heartbreaking, a reminder of a relationship he had damaged through neglect. The queen he once dazzled with riddles was long gone. The foreign dignitaries who had marveled at his wisdom were only memories in the kingdom's lore. The alliances formed through countless marriages had exacted a bitter toll, and all the riches stockpiled in the treasury didn't bring peace to his troubled soul. In his private chambers, he reviewed scrolls containing his proverbs, collections of insight now overshadowed by the irony that he, the author of such wisdom, had forsaken it in practice. While leafing through those writings, he reflected on the vanity of chasing worldly passions, a sentiment that dominated his later work, known as Ecclesiastes. The phrase, "everything is meaningless," rang through his mind, echoing like a bell toll that couldn't be silenced. Imagine the inner struggle, knowing you once walked closely with the Almighty, but now standing at the precipice of your life, burdened by the realization that disobedience had led to emptiness. Solomon's sense of futility found words in Ecclesiastes. His lament that every pursuit, from pleasure to labor, left him unsatisfied without the anchor of godly devotion. It said he might have penned these reflections with trembling hands, mourning the days he could never retrieve. The man who had once soared so high came to understand the fragile nature of earthly achievements. Wealth, temporary; political power, easily shattered. Even wisdom, if divorced from obedience, turned into a bitter reminder of what might have been. As the final day advanced, courtiers still addressed him as Your Majesty, still bowed respectfully, still treated him as the famed King Solomon. Yet behind those formalities lay an unspoken knowledge that the glorious age of Solomon was ending. Some had heard the rumors the kingdom would be ripped apart after his passing. Others quietly mourned the king they once admired, unsure how to reconcile the radiant stories of his past with the gloom pervading the latter years of his rule. By evening, many suspect Solomon's thoughts drifted to his father, David, who, despite serious failings, had always repented earnestly and clung to God. Perhaps Solomon reflected on the difference between making a mistake but returning wholeheartedly to the Lord versus allowing a series of small compromises to harden one's heart until turning back seemed too daunting. In those last days, the mighty king, once unstoppable, found his entire life encapsulated in one stark truth. Anything apart from God is destined for emptiness. Once, he had everything a person could dream of: power, respect, unimaginable fortune, a peaceful kingdom. Yet the final verdict he wrote about his own life was that all those pursuits without true devotion amounted to a chasing after the wind. Some might wonder if he uttered a final prayer of repentance. The scriptures don't record it explicitly, leaving room for both hope and caution. What we do know is that his last day stands as an enduring lesson. Even the richest blessings can wither when the heart no longer beats in harmony with the giver of those blessings. Solomon's downfall begs a sobering question. If a man handpicked by God, endowed with wisdom beyond measure, and surrounded by blessings could lose sight of his calling, how much more vulnerable are we? His story is a mirror reflecting the allure of pride, comfort, and unchecked compromise. It demonstrates that faith is not a one-time act, but a continual journey requiring vigilance. On a practical level, Solomon's narrative warns that unwise alliances, whether friendships, business partnerships, or personal entanglements, can nudge us away from our core values. One small compromise can be the first step on a slippery slope, especially if pride convinces us we're above falling. The caution is clear. We must guard our hearts, remain humble, and consistently realign ourselves with God's standards. Yet there's also reassurance woven into Solomon's story. If even he, in all his splendor, recognized the futility of a life that drifts from God, then any of us can learn from his regrets and avoid repeating them. His final reflections in Ecclesiastes don't end in total despair. They point to the enduring truth that revering God and obeying his commands is the ultimate source of meaning. In times of success, we can recall Solomon's example to remain grounded. In moments when we taste wealth, recognition, or influence, we do well to ask, am I still putting God first? Or am I quietly building altars in my heart to worldly idols? Solomon's regret underscores how crucial it is to remain steadfast, no matter how bright our worldly opportunities might shine. There's also a note of transformation here for anyone who might feel they've strayed too far. Solomon's life reveals that catastrophic decisions begin with smaller steps away from God. But it also implies that a single turn back, an act of humility and genuine remorse, might change everything. While the scriptures leave some ambiguity about his final hours, they nevertheless champion the theme of repentance found throughout the Bible. Today, many face temptations that mirror Solomon's challenges. Whether you're tempted by material success, entangled in complicated relationships, or simply drifting in your spiritual life, let the downfall of the wisest king in the world be both a warning and a call to return. Even if we've built empires on shaky foundations, we still have a chance to reset our priorities. The biggest tragedy is not failing, but failing to learn from those stumbles. Solomon's entire story stands like a lighthouse on a rocky shore, flashing signals that the waters ahead are dangerous if navigated with arrogance. He had glimpsed the pinnacle of human potential, only to realize that without God, the view from the top is hollow. Solomon's final day was a sobering end to a life that began with such promise. From the dawn of his reign, when he sought wisdom over riches, through the grandeur of the temple dedication and the avalanche of global admiration, his story soared to heights unimaginable. But the same heart once aligned so closely with the Almighty drifted into compromise, ultimately facing the heartbreak of a diminished legacy. What does it mean for us? Solomon's life reminds us that true wisdom is not about how eloquently we speak or how much we accumulate, but about how faithfully we stay connected to God's guidance. Pride can blind the sharpest mind, and unchecked temptations can ensnare even the most devout spirit. If this story touched you, consider leaving a comment with your thoughts. What part of Solomon's rise or fall resonated the most for you? By sharing, you might inspire someone else to avoid a similar pitfall or find hope if they feel they've already strayed too far. Feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can stay connected to more faith-driven stories. Turn on notifications to ensure you never miss an update. Sometimes one timely lesson can spark a life-changing turnaround. And if you know anyone wrestling with pride, temptation, or spiritual lukewarmness, share this message with them.